Welcome to Faith and Science. I'm Dr. John Ashton. The other day I was chatting with some friends and invited them to come to a presentation on the astronomical evidence that the solar system was young. One of the local churches was putting on a program where they were showing a DVD by a former NASA engineer, and he was going to be explaining some of the evidence for a young solar system that fits into with the biblical creation model of only 6,000 years or so. And so I invited our friends who were chatting away, and our friends are Christians too, and the husband said, well, how young do they think the solar system is going to be? And well, I wasn't quite sure what the video was going to say because I hadn't actually seen it. But I knew it supported biblical creation, so I said, well, it'll support the biblical account of creation of only thousands of years. And the husband said, well, how does that fit in with the fact that here in Australia we have Australian Aboriginal early civilization or early activity remains that have been dated as 40,000 years old? And he mentioned in particular a program that they'd seen on the ABC television about caves up in the Kakadu National Park, where there were extensive Aboriginal paintings had been discovered by some French archaeologists and archaeologists working with other archaeologists from Australian universities as well. And they had carbon dated some of the layers in these paintings, and also some of the soot layers over the top of some of the paintings. And they'd come up with a series of ages as they carbon dated and went back 40,000. I think the oldest ones were about 40,000 years. I went and looked up the site on the internet there, the archaeological findings and the carbon-14 dating. Now, I've spoken about carbon-14 dating before and how this carbon-14 dating isn't an absolute measure. It depends on the calibration curves that we use, and these calibration curves that we use are then set up using other forms of dating such as tree rings and the varves in lakes and these sort of things that are based on assumption that these rings and layers and so forth correspond to annual layers. So there's a whole lot of circular reasoning there. And I've discussed earlier on that, there's a lot of problems with this. And when we look at these calibration curves and other data that we have on the basis of the Earth's magnetic field declining, the carbon-14 levels being much lower in the atmosphere in the past, and all this sort of thing, we do these corrections. It brings these long ages back to only a few thousand years and well within the biblical time frame. The problem that highlighted at that time with our friends was that, of course, they weren't aware of this. They had accepted at face value these ages of 40,000 years as if they are a fact. And this is one of the big issues that I guess Christians face, and as we try to understand the creation model and the biblical model, and why a lot of people that are Christians are moving over to a theistic evolution interpretation of the fossil record and trying to explain all these older dates that we see, is the lack of awareness that these dates that are put up on these television programs and are being used by the archaeologists in our universities and the paleontologists and this sort of thing, they haven't actually been validated. They haven't actually been proved. They're fitting an old Earth model, a old solar system model, a model that says that the Earth was formed approximately 4.5 billion years ago, that and at least the solar system at least must be 4.5 billion years old, and essentially they date the universe as being in the order of 12 billion years old, maybe 13, these sort of orders of magnitude. And because these are presented repeatedly within the media, then it can be expected that the average person that is going about their daily life, trying to be a good person in the community, a good parent and so forth, come to accept, well, these must be facts. The important thing is that these long ages have not been verified as being accurately, as being the true ages. And I've talked to, previously about other data that we have, such as the continents would erode in less than 10 million years. We've got and yet we date the continents at 2,500 billion years. There's all this conflicting information. If we radiometrically date recent lava flows, the historical lava flows that we saw them erupt, we get hundreds of millions of years. And I point out that the classic work that was done on the Mount Nawahoe volcano eruptions, where the lava from the 1948 and early 1950 eruptions was dated by the Australian National University team. They're using, the modern isochron dating methods that are used, and the ages came out, from 130 million years up to 3,500 million years, depending on the radioisotope system that they used, for rocks that were only 50 years old at the time when those measurements were made in 2000. And similarly, when we date those, carbon date the Aboriginal ash remains and so forth in their caves, and we get these figures like 40,000 years, we forget we get those same ages for coal. When we carbon date coal, we get the same ages. When we carbon date dinosaur remains, we get 25,000 years, 30,000 years, this sort of thing. So what we're doing is the picture, when we date the dinosaurs, when we date the coal, then we don't hear much about that on the news. No, that doesn't come out in the news. But when we date the, something with the indigenous findings, whether it's here in Australia or in China or somewhere else, and we get these, or Africa, and we get these ages of 40,000 years. Oh, yes, this is human activity dating back to these ages. But they're all coming back the same. What it's saying is that if we look at this data that we have, when we date the coal, it comes back at the same ages as we date these deposits where there was definite human activity. So what we need to understand is that these dating methods aren't giving us what the actual ages are, and there's all different ways to attempt to calibrate them. And I guess I felt disappointed that our friends, or there's our couple that we're good friends with, again this conflict. Well, they weren't interested in coming along so much and seeing the program that highlighted the astronomical evidence again that the solar system itself is young. And I found the program. I went along to the DVD showing, and it was at the church on the Sunday afternoon. It was very revealing. The guy was very clear, and there were a few points that really stood out to me. Now, one of the planets that we hear a lot about is Saturn. and particularly because of its ring, this ring system. And the speaker on the program highlighted some really interesting things about Saturn. Now, when we think of planets in our solar system, we think of, we get pictures of Mars sent back. Then there's talk about sending an expedition. Astronauts out to Mars to land humans on Mars, and a new project. We've landed humans on the moon. It's land humans on Mars, and and we've sent different probes there, and they've landed and so forth. But I think what many of us forget, including, and I had forgotten at the time as well, that these giant planets, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus and Neptune, these outer 4 planets, major planets in our solar system, are actually gas giants. They're not made out of rock. They're made out of gases. They're made out of hydrogen, which is the lightest and simplest gas and atom, just a single proton in the nucleus there, and if there are the isotopes there, then you may have none or 1 or 2 neutrons there in a single atom, or helium. The other gas that they're made out of, which of course there's 2 protons in the nucleus and 2 neutrons, and the orbiting electron. So these are extremely light elements. They're gases. Now, at very low temperatures, of course, they can become liquids, and of course at really, 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 really low temperatures they become solids, and hydrogen, for example, can exhibit metallic properties. So here is a gas. So when it's in that state, it has really, really interesting and unusual behaviour that scientists study. But that's what these planets are not solid rock as we would imagine them. They are gas. They're made out of gases. Now, one of the interesting aspects is that how did the solar system form? Well, we have this gas-dust nebulae theory that you had this big spinning ball of dust and gases and so forth, and gradually they condensed into the different planets. Well, it's interesting. The fact that these gas giants are still there doesn't actually fit with any planet formation model that would sustain them over, billions of years. If that was the case, they should have actually just been drawn back into the sun and absorbed. And this space expert pointed that out, that these planets, in actual fact, if they were that old, if they were the 4.5 billion years old, they shouldn't be there. These gas planets shouldn't be there. Now, Saturn is a really interesting one because we have a lot of data on that. So quite a bit of this data was published actually very, very recently, in the last year or so, from the Cassini-Huygens missions, spacecraft, which studied the Saturn system back in 2017. It went past there. It had been sent back information and had been out there for about 13 years prior to that. And one of the phenomena the spacecraft measured is the infall of dust and other material onto the rings of Saturn. So as Saturn moves through space, these rings. Now, it found that these rings are accumulating significant amounts of dust. Now, and this incoming material darkens the rings. So these rings that are made up of quite actual small particles around these rings. The rings actually don't contain very much material. There's an illustration that has been used that these rings are actually very thin. If we made a large-scale model of Saturn, and it was the size of a large city, like the size of Sydney, then the rings would only be the thickness of a sheet of paper. So these rings are actually quite thin when you look at them edge on. They're made up of particles of quite small particles of rock and ice, and these rings orbit in this really, really narrow plane, just in this amazing narrow plane. There's actually no known explanation for how those rings could have formed and why they're so thin, why they're just in that really, really thin layer around Saturn. And it's very interesting. As I said, this spacecraft is looking at the rate at which these material are accumulating on the rings. And the rings, however, are not all that dark. And again, when we look at the rate of which the material is accumulating, if Saturn was really as old as, we say the Earth is and the rings around it, then they just wouldn't be there. They wouldn't just look the way they are. The rings must be young. This is the evidence that we have now. And it appears that, astronomers have come up with all sorts of explanations to try and explain, well, how come the rings are really young? Why should they be that young? So this is, one of the fascinating things about, and just one little example that really stood out to me is that the amount of material, and there's a lot of material raining down on these rings. The other thing is that the rings are disappearing as well. They're slowly, the ice is evaporating and this sort of thing. And again, from the rate at which the material in the rings is slowly being dissipated, again, all this evidence points that these rings and the planets are very young. And so, again, from the rate at which they've measured that the planets, that these rings are losing material, they can't be very old. So this is, again, we have this evidence just with this planet, something like Saturn, that it's quite these little subtle points, all these points that are pointing to the fact that it's are very young. Now, Saturn has a moon called Enceladus, Enceladus, and when they looked at the picture or studied this moon, what it looks like, there's a huge geyser coming out of it, absolutely huge. It's spewing material into space at a great rate. And when they look at the rate, and I've seen the picture of this, and really it's if you imagine a balloon, a typical balloon, and say you blew the balloon up a little bit, and you've got the neck of the balloon where you've blown it up. So at the photograph that I saw of Enceladus, the size of this geyser in proportion to the size of the moon is the size of the thickness of the opening where you blow the balloon up. And so this is this massive geyser that is spewing material out of it into outer space. So again, there's no explanation as to how this particular moon, which is covered with ice, by the way, seems to have an ice surface on it, can be producing this material. Now, one of the issues is with these planets that are so far out, that are so small like that, these smaller moons, that they should have cooled down so much that there shouldn't be any of this sort of activity still happening. There shouldn't be any, molten or gaseous material still coming out of the, like water. I'm not sure if it's water or methane coming out, but whatever the material is coming out of this geyser. But it's really spectacular. As I said, if you see the photograph of it that was taken, you've got the it's sort of like a neck of the balloon that, and you haven't fully blown up. And I'm talking about blowing up a balloon so that, it's really tight. It's when you get to that stage where you're starting to blow the balloon up and there's still quite a substantial neck on it where you're blowing it up. So, that's a huge amount of material now is coming out of this particular moon. And again, for that to be happening, it can't be that old. Here we are, we're watching, it's happening now. So these are just some of the classic things that they're finding out there. The other one, Jupiter, as I said, another gas giant. It's not made of solid material. It's made of gas, hydrogen and helium, largely. And it has a moon that Io, just spelt I-O. It's one of the moons, and it is solid. It has solid material, and it's volcanically active. Now, again, this is a small. It's a moon out there, so far out. It's a long way from the sun. It should have really cooled down. There shouldn't be any volcanic activity anymore on that moon if it was that old. Another one is when we look at one of the things that fascinated me in this program was that Uranus, so you've got Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune. Uranus actually rotates backwards. So it rotates in the opposite direction to what it does around us. So it's sort of like how our planets spin. It rotates backwards, and I think it rotates at right angles too. I'm just trying to think. Well, I'm pretty sure that was the planet that he talked about. So as all the other planets spin more or less on the same with parallel axis as they go around the sun, whereas Uranus goes around the sun as if it's a rotating football at right angles to the rotation, which is quite interesting. And again, it's another gas planet. It's out of gas. When we look at Neptune, the next planet out, and perhaps the furthest of these larger gas planets, again, hydrogen and helium is what it's made of, but it shouldn't exist anymore. It should have been actually just drawn back into the sun and just not exist as a gas planet anymore. But it's there, it's existing. And it has quite a substantial amount of methane. Now, Neptune has a moon called Triton, and again, it has a massive volcano belching material out into space. And again, way out there, it should have cooled down. It shouldn't be volcanic active material anymore. Another fascinating thing is that Triton orbits Neptune in the opposite direction. So it's quite fascinating. So yes, and that's right. Uranus rotates in the opposite direction, as I mentioned, to all the other planets except I think Venus. So these little things like this moon of Triton at Neptune out there, it's fascinating. How can these planets, if they're all formed from some mechanistic thing, some be orbiting in the opposite direction, totally in the opposite direction, or totally at right angles with their orbits? The picture that we have, and really, really strong evidence was presented in this program. I felt it was very compelling evidence that these planets in our solar system were created only very recently, and they were created specifically with specific properties and specific orbits. They don't fit into a pattern that would logically evolve from some overall mechanism breaking down. And this is because of the characteristics of their rotations and the existence of these gas planets and the existence of the rings, that if they were really that old, they would have dissipated, they'd be much darker. All these different aspects we look at. The presenter talked about the types of magnetic fields that some of these planets have. Some of them generate strong magnetic fields from the metallic hydrogen effect. And the nature of these magnetic fields really can't be explained in terms of current magnetic dynamo theories. So, and the strength of the magnetic fields, again, all these things point to these planets being young. If the people listening are interested in watching these videos, they are up online, I've found out. Of course, at the end of the program, they put up the website, and the website is called creationastronomy, all one word, .com, creationastronomy.com. And I would recommend Googling that and having a look at the videos, because the guy puts up on the screen the references to the peer-reviewed astronomy journals where this data is there, where leading astronomers point out they've got no explanation for how these planets could form and be the way they are. They've got no explanation as to how those planets could be there when they should have, disappeared a long time ago. They shouldn't exist there, and so forth. No explanation for how there can be volcanic activity happening still in planets that are so small, so far away from the sun and so young, and yet meant to be so old. They should have frozen solid by now. So we have so much information that all is pointing back to the biblical position and fits with the biblical position that our solar system was only created thousands of years ago. And I think this should be so encouraging to us all, those of us who believe in the Bible, that the Bible is true. It is telling us about a wonderful Creator God who loves us, who came as Jesus Christ to save us. And when I look at the science now is all pointing back to a young Earth and a young solar system, just as the Bible said. You've been listening to Faith and Science, and remember you can listen to these programs too by Googling 3ABN Australia.org.au and click on the listen button. And there you'll see programs, Faith and Science, Science Conversations, and many other great programs. Again, you've been listening to Faith and Science. I'm Dr. John Ashton. Have a great day.
You've been listening to a production of 3ABN Australia Radio.